Hi everyone, and welcome to the Secondary Data Analysis lecture video. In this lecture video, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about what secondary data is and highlight the advantages of secondary data from a researcher's point of view. As I've discussed previously, secondary data analysis occurs when you use someone else's data to answer your own research questions. So secondary data analysis does not require you to collect your own data. That said, secondary research does still require you to come up with your own research question because you usually don't want to duplicate the exact research question used by the original author. In some cases, though, you may want to duplicate that research question, excuse me, but then use a new analysis technique to test your hypothesis. For many authors, though, they will come up with their own research question and analysis strategy completely independent of the data set by picking the research question and analytic strategy first, and then seeking out a data set that contains the appropriate data for their analysis. The primary advantage of secondary data analysis relates to time and money. Because the data has already been collected by someone else, secondary data analysis is much faster than primary data analysis. It also requires much less resources. Secondary data is particularly useful for longitudinal analyses, as there are a multitude of government databases available that contain data going back years, if not decades, already compiled and ready to go. That type of access simply isn't possible if you start with your own longitudinal research study. Another advantage of secondary data analysis is that it is often done using public use data. For ethical purposes, public use data is required to be de-identified, meaning that the data has been stripped of all identifying information. Now here's the great thing about that. The data set is now completely anonymous, and you don't know who provided any of the responses. Because of this, there is no way for you to accidentally violate a research subject's privacy, and so research using de-identified secondary data is often exempt from IRB review. Remember that exempt research only requires the IRB chair to review the protocol to ensure it matches the requirements for an exempt study. So you don't have to go through the full board or even an expedited process, which makes getting through the preliminary research stages much easier. Shown here is an excerpt from the UT Tyler IRB's type of review document. There are several different categories of exempt research. Exemption category 2 is for research that uses tests, surveys, interviews, or observations that are collected in such a way that information cannot be readily linked back to any subject, meaning de-identified data. Now, one of the challenges of secondary data analysis is that since you're not involved in the original data collection, you have to figure out how the data was measured and collected from the data itself. That's why public use data often comes with multiple documents. Usually, the authors will include a copy of the interview or the survey questionnaire so that you can see the exact format in which data was collected. They will also provide information about the data collected methodology, including their sampling procedures, their population of interest, their data collection method, etc. And then they will provide a data file that you can download. Now, most downloads offer multiple options for commonly used statistical programs like SPSS, Stata, and R, and they also may allow for a simple Microsoft Excel download. Finally, most public use datasets also include a codebook for download so as to help you understand the data file. Like we talked about in the survey research module, a codebook can help you read through the data file just like you were reading the original survey. Now, secondary data sources will also usually come with a list or a link to previous publications that have used that data. If you then use that data for future publications, you must acknowledge the original source in your manuscript, and then yours will be added to the collection of documents. Secondary data analysis has a lot of advantages, especially the limited resources required before data analysis begins. However, one of the primary limitations of secondary data analysis is that your research design can never be better than the original research design. It doesn't matter if you randomly sample from your database. If you are using a secondary data set that collected subjects via convenience sampling, a non-probability sampling method, it's going to limit your external validity, no matter what you do. Another common concern relates to missing data. If the researchers have a lot of missing data, meaning they didn't record information for all the variables or all the participants, then your research will have a lot of missing data. There is no way to overcome the shortcomings of the original research data collection design when you're doing secondary data analysis. That's why secondary data analysts have to be picky about what type of data they're using. choosing to use samples from national or state agencies, which are usually gathered using probability sampling methods and have more resources allocated to reduce missing data, are a lot more helpful often than some privately collected data sets. Many of these may be collected by individual researchers, and such they may not have high internal or external validity to begin with. The last concern I want to talk about with secondary data relates to internal validity. Because you're using a data set in a way that it was not collected for, oftentimes secondary data analysis does not include the best operationalizations of the concepts under study. For example, a researcher interested in religion can find several different questions about religious attendance, religious affiliation, and religious ideology in the General Social Survey, or the GSS. If the researcher wants to measure religious satisfaction, they may have to use what is called a proxy measure, meaning they'll use a different variable or a set of variables to stand in for the variable they're interested in examining. So if the GSS doesn't contain a specific question asking respondents about their satisfaction with their religious institution, the researcher can use proxy variables, like the number of services attended each week, to substitute for the original variable. This substitution works under the assumption that you would only go to your religious services often if you're satisfied with them. But notice we're making an assumption here that may or may not actually be true. This reduces the internal validity of our research study because the researcher may not be actually measuring what they think they're measuring using the proxy variables. All right, well, that concludes our discussion of secondary data analysis. Join me in the next video lecture as we explore the different sources of secondary data. Thanks for watching, everyone.